Hi everybody, my name is Elliot, and what I'd like to talk to you about today is the incredible and sad tale of innocent Erendira and her heartless grandmother. Now, I came across an article by Diane Marting. It was published in the 2001 edition of the Hispanic Review, and it's titled The End of Erendira's Prostitution. Now, Marting basically says that most critics have focused on the magical fairy tale elements of this novella, and the sort of oppressive childhood prostitution theme has really kind of gotten ignored and pushed to the sidelines. But obviously, that's what this novel is about, and so Marting focuses her attention on that. Now, according to published interviews with Marquez, the author, he wrote this tale based on an experience he had as a 16-year-old boy when he saw an 11-year-old girl working as a prostitute. Now, this girl was accompanied by a woman whom Marquez at the time presumed to be a relative, but later it turns out was sort of a slaveholder, if you will, to this girl. Marquez has written about prostitution in other stories. In 100 Years of Solitude, for instance, which is one of his most famous works. In that book, he describes an adolescent boy who feels pity for a young prostitute in similar circumstances to Erendira. Now, in 1983, Marquez actually had an interview with Playboy magazine, and he has this to say about prostitution. Quote, "Prostitutes were my friends to me when I was a very young man. Real friends. The environment I grew up in was very repressive. It wasn't easy to have a relationship with a woman who wasn't a prostitute. When I went to see prostitutes, it wasn't really to make love, but more to be with someone, not to be alone. The prostitutes in my books are always very human, and they are very good company. They are solitary women who hate their work." End quote. Now, going back to Erendira, really, obviously, she's more than just a prostitute. She's sort of a human slave, if you will. Now, this has interesting parallels to what's going on today with this sort of vast criminal network that we've called, or come to term, human trafficking. Or sometimes it will be referred to as trafficking in human persons. I found this on a website. It's called humantrafficking.org. And basically, they say the groundwork for this criminal enterprise comes from poverty, lack of economic opportunity. Those two things make women and children potential victims of these traffickers. And it's turned into a huge criminal, it's an international organization. A lot of times these women are lured into it with promises of economic opportunity. When they reach a sort of a staging area, sometimes they're given official documents. They can even be bonded money that they then, or at a later date, have to turn around and repay to their captives. So it really is, in all ways, sort of a modern form of slavery. Now, women and children are most vulnerable to trafficking, but it's not limited to women and children, and it's also not limited to sexual exploitation. There's many cases of people being trafficked into sweatshops, trafficked into agricultural plantations, and into domestic service as well. Some of the countries listed on the human trafficking website include Australia, Burma, Cambodia, China, East Timor, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Mongolia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, and even the United States. So it's a very wide area, and this is a very widespread problem. Now, the United Nations estimates that as many as 2.4 million people across the globe are victims of human trafficking at any given time. When you split this up, in terms of the division, about 80% are being exploited as sexual slaves, and about 20% are being pushed into these forced labor markets, including homes and sweatshops. It's a big industry. It's about a $32 billion industry, $32 billion being earned every year by these criminals who run these networks. and about 2 out of every 3 victims are women. Now, when did this start? If we go back to 1949, that's when the UN first became concerned and started documenting this problem and labeling it as this modern form of slavery. Now, returning to Marquez's book, what exactly was he talking about? Well, it's unlikely that when this book came out in the 70s, he was referring to the same type of human slavery, human trafficking that we have today. But it was social commentary, and Marquez was talking about a similar type of phenomenon that we have today. Now, people like to look at the case of Erendira and say, well, how fantastic or how realistic is her story, you know. People look at the, Martin, for instance, looks at the nitty-gritty of what's going on with her, and when the grandmother's operation is in full swing, Erendira is actually servicing about 100 men a night. And most people look at this and say, well, this is hyperbole, it's greatly exaggerated, it's not realistic. But in fact, as Martin points out, a lot of documented cases of women being used as sex slaves are similar in function to Erendira's case. One such case is Kathleen Berry, who was a researcher, and she found out that there were these hotels in the North African quarter of Paris. I can't pronounce the name of the quarter. My French isn't very good. But in each of these hotels, there were about 6 or 7 girls, and they were servicing between 80 and 120 customers a night. And that was during the weekdays, and then weekends and holidays, it was up to or close to 150. It was a very structured operation. Each male customer would pay approximately $6 US. They would be ushered into the room, and then a buzzer would go off every 6 minutes, and another customer would be pushed into the room. So very depraved, very depressing sort of situation, and it just shows you, it illustrates that, well, Erendira's case may not be as far-fetched as we'd like to believe, as readers, as people. Martin sort of closes her essay by saying that the fantastic element of the tale is really these sort of magical things that are going on around Erendira, and also the ending with the grandmother in this sort of very heightened climax where the grandmother is slain by Ulysses is obviously very sort of exaggerated and fantastical. But when you get down to it, the nitty-gritty side of the story with Erendira, because Marquez intended it to be social commentary, he has sort of created this very depressing tale that turns out to be, in the end, almost factual in a sense. Well, I've read other of Marquez's stories, and they're all very enjoyable. But obviously this one is pretty depressing. But I think it's a cautionary tale, which really warns that this is kind of a terrible life, and this is what has happened to these people. Well, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys on the forums. Thanks.